Colonel Mason's laughter echoed through the Afghan briefing room as he dismissed the civilian translator's tactical warning. Her crime, suggesting that his elite special forces unit was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Impossible, he knew. She was just a contractor brought in to handle local dialects, not someone who could possibly understand military strategy. His officers joined the mockery as she sat silently in the corner, watching them plan what would become a massacre. Then the valley exploded around them, and the woman they had dismissed as worthless began giving orders with an authority that made hardened soldiers obey without question. What happened next would reveal that the quiet translator possessed skills that would save them all, and a military background that would destroy everything Mason thought he knew about warfare. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more tales of hidden warriors and moments when true expertise silences arrogance. Specialist Arya Chen adjusted her headset and reviewed the mission briefing one final time. The fluorescent lights in the temporary command center cast harsh shadows across the topographical maps spread before Colonel Timothy Mason and his staff. Outside, the Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on Forward Operating Base Courage, a collection of prefabricated buildings and defensive positions carved into the mountainous terrain near the Pakistan border. Arya sat quietly at a small desk in the corner, her presence barely acknowledged by the military personnel planning the next day's operation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same khaki contractor uniform as the other civilian support staff. Nothing about her suggested she was anything more than what her identification badge claimed: linguistic specialist, Pashto and Dari translator. Colonel Mason paced before a detailed satellite map, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything important. Intelligence indicates the Taliban cell is operating from this compound, he said, tapping a location with his pointer. Approximately 40 hostiles armed with small arms and possibly RPGs. Captain Rodriguez, the operations officer, leaned forward to study the map. "Sir, the approach route takes us through this valley. It's a natural choke point." "Noted, Captain, but it's also the fastest route to the target. Speed is essential for this operation." Mason's tone brooked no disagreement. From her corner, Arya glanced up from her notebook. The approach route Colonel Mason had selected would take the team directly through what locals called the Valley of Echoes, a narrow pass that had been the site of 3 ambushes in the past 6 months. She knew this because she had spent the previous evening speaking with village elders in the nearby settlement, gathering intelligence that hadn't made it into the official briefing. Lieutenant Thompson, fresh out of officer training, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, what about alternative routes? The terrain analysis suggests..." "The terrain analysis was conducted by personnel who understand military tactics, Lieutenant," Colonel Mason interrupted, his voice taking on an edge. "We stick to the plan." Arya cleared her throat softly, her hand instinctively moving to cover a small tattoo on her inner wrist, barely visible ink that matched symbols she'd seen on classified documents years ago. "Excuse me, Colonel." Mason turned, irritation flickering across his face. "Yes, miss?" He paused, clearly having forgotten her name, despite this being their 3rd planning session. "Chen, sir. I wanted to mention that the local villagers have reported unusual activity in the valley approach. They've been avoiding that route for the past 2 weeks." Mason's expression shifted from irritation to condescension. "Miss Chen, your job is to translate what people say, not to provide tactical analysis. The intelligence has been verified through proper channels." Several officers exchanged glances, some suppressing smiles at their colonel's dismissal of the civilian contractor. Arya noticed Captain Rodriguez shift uncomfortably, but he remained silent. Something in his eyes suggested he'd seen that tattoo before, in places where civilians weren't supposed to be. "With respect, sir," Arya continued, her voice steady despite the dangerous ground she was treading, "the villagers mentioned specific details about armed groups using the valley as..." "Are you a military officer, Miss Chen?" Mason's voice had grown cold. The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. For a split second, Arya's facade almost cracked. Her posture straightened slightly, her eyes hardening in a way that made Rodriguez lean forward with sudden interest. "No, sir," she said finally, but the hesitation spoke volumes to anyone trained to notice such things. "Do you have training in combat operations or tactical planning?" Another pause. Another moment where the truth almost broke through 3 years of careful deception. "Sir, I was just relaying local intelligence that might—" "That's what I thought." Mason turned back to his officers, effectively dismissing her. "Gentlemen, we deploy at 600. Questions about actual military matters?" The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Arya remaining silent in her corner. She made notes not just about translation requirements, but about the operation's glaring vulnerabilities. The route Colonel Mason had chosen ignored 3 separate intelligence reports about increased Taliban activity. The timing would put them in the valley during morning prayers, when the echoing call to prayer would mask the sound of movement. Most critically, the extraction plan assumed the primary route would remain secure. But there was something else. Something in the way Rodriguez kept glancing at her, his eyes lingering on the spot where her sleeve had briefly pulled back to reveal that small tattoo. She'd been careful for 3 years. One moment of carelessness might unravel everything. As the officers filed out, Captain Rodriguez approached Arya's desk, but his expression held something new. Recognition. Fear. "Chen, walk with me." They stepped outside into the oppressive Afghan heat. Rodriguez glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then spoke quietly. "What weren't you saying in there?" Arya studied his face, seeing genuine concern rather than dismissiveness, but also something else, suspicion. The village elder mentioned seeing vehicles moving weapons into the valley, not just small arms, heavy equipment. How heavy? He described sounds consistent with heavy machine gun emplacements being constructed, multiple positions. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "Chen, that tattoo on your wrist, where did you get it?" The question hit like a physical blow. Arya kept her expression neutral, but inside, alarms were screaming. "I'm sorry?" "The symbol. I've seen it before in classified briefings." Rodriguez stepped closer. "It's not supposed to exist on civilians." The tattoo artist's hands had been steady despite the unusual request. "You sure about this stuff, Sergeant? It's not coming off." She'd stared at the design, a symbol that would mark her as belonging to operations that officially never happened. "I'm sure. This is the kind of ink that gets people killed if they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or keeps them alive if they're in the right place." "I don't know what you're talking about, Captain," Arya said carefully. "It's just a design I liked." But Rodriguez wasn't buying it. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. "Chen, I need you to very slowly and very carefully tell me who you really are." The moment stretched between them like a tripwire. 3 years of careful deception balanced on the edge of a blade. In the distance, the call to prayer began echoing across the valley, the same sound that would mask tomorrow's ambush. "Captain," Arya said quietly, "some questions are better left unasked. Not when my men's lives are at stake." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing options that could save lives or destroy everything she'd worked for. "Your colonel is a good man, but he doesn't understand unconventional warfare. Tomorrow, people are going to die. Then stop it. I can't. Not without revealing things that would get more people killed." Rodriguez's radio crackled with Mason's voice calling him back. Their conversation was over, but Arya could see in his eyes that this wasn't finished. He would be watching her now, looking for more cracks in her carefully constructed facade. That evening, as the base prepared for the morning operation, Arya sat in her small quarters, staring at a satellite communication device hidden behind a panel in her footlocker. 3 messages from Langley blinked on the secure screen, each one more urgent than the last. The first was routine: maintain cover, continue intelligence gathering. The second was a warning: increased chatter suggests compromise. Exercise extreme caution. The third made her blood run cold: asset potentially burned, recommend immediate extraction. But extraction meant abandoning 42 soldiers to a massacre she could prevent. It meant letting Mason walk into a trap that would haunt the families of dead soldiers for generations. Arya opened her laptop and began composing a situation report that would never be sent through official military channels. Instead, it would reach a small group of people who operated in the spaces between conventional military structure and intelligence operations. People who understood that sometimes saving lives required breaking every rule in the book. The secure communication came at 2000 hours, waking Arya from restless sleep. The message was brief. Authorization granted. Full discretion. Ghost protocol active. Ghost protocol. She hadn't heard those words in 3 years, but they still sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. It meant the gloves were off. It meant Staff Sergeant Chen could surface long enough to save Captain Rodriguez and his men, then disappear forever. But it also meant the end of Arya Chen, linguistics specialist. After tomorrow, she would have to become someone else entirely. At 05:45 hours, Colonel Mason's convoy rolled out of Fob Courage, 12 vehicles carrying 42 soldiers, following the exact route he had planned despite the warnings he had dismissed. Arya rode in the 7th vehicle, ostensibly to provide translation services if they encountered civilians. In reality, she was there for reasons that Colonel Mason would never understand, carrying equipment that officially didn't exist and operating under authorization that came from levels of government he'd never reach. The convoy moved efficiently through the pre-dawn darkness, night vision equipment scanning the mountainous terrain for threats. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. The soldiers were alert but confident, trusting in their colonel's tactical expertise and superior firepower. But Arya noticed things the others missed. The unusual silence of birds that should have been active at this hour. The absence of animal tracks on paths that normally saw wildlife movement. Most tellingly, the complete lack of civilian foot traffic in an area that normally saw herders moving their flocks. As they entered the Valley of Echoes, she reached for her radio, then hesitated. Mason had made it clear that her input wasn't welcome, but watching through her night vision scope, she could see the infrared signatures of at least 15 positions overlooking their route. Heavy weapons, coordinated fields of fire. This wasn't just an ambush, it was an execution. "Captain Rodriguez," she said quietly into her headset, using the command frequency. "What is it, Chen? We need to stop the convoy, now." "Based on what intelligence? Based on the fact that we're about to drive into a kill zone." Rodriguez's voice was tight. "Chen, you're a translator. You don't have authority to—" "Captain, in about 30 seconds, you're going to see what authority I actually have." Before Rodriguez could respond, the world exploded around them. The first IED detonated under the lead vehicle, flipping the armoured Humvee and blocking the convoy's forward progress. Simultaneously, heavy machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the valley. The ambush was perfectly coordinated, executed with military precision by fighters who had been planning this moment for weeks. "Contact left! Contact right!" Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio as soldiers scrambled for defensive positions. Colonel Mason's voice cut through the chaos. "All units, maintain formation and return fire. We're pushing through." Arya dove from her vehicle as bullets shattered the windshield. Around her, soldiers were establishing a defensive perimeter, but their position was untenable. The Taliban had chosen their ground perfectly, with elevated firing positions that commanded the entire valley floor. "Sir," Captain Rodriguez reported, "we're taking heavy casualties. Request permission to withdraw to alternate route." "Negative," Mason replied. "We complete the mission." From her position behind a boulder, Arya watched the tactical situation deteriorate rapidly. 3 vehicles were now disabled, and the convoy was effectively trapped in a kill zone. The soldiers were well trained and brave, but they were fighting an enemy that held every advantage. She reached for her secure communication device and sent a 3-word message. "Authorization requested. Emergency." The response came within seconds. Green light. Full authority. What happened next would be debated in classified briefings for years to come. Arya Chen, the quiet translator who had been dismissed and ridiculed, stood up in the middle of a firefight and began moving with skills that made seasoned soldiers stop and stare. She keyed her radio to the command frequency, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. "All units, this is operational control. implementing tactical override under Section 7 authority. Who the hell is operational control? Mason's voice was sharp with confusion and anger. Colonel, this is Chen. I'm assuming tactical command of this operation. The radio fell silent except for the continued sounds of gunfire. Then Mason's voice returned, filled with incredulous rage. You're a civilian translator. You have no authority to. Check your classified briefing appendix, Colonel. Section 7 Emergency Protocols. Rodriguez's voice cut in, and Arya could hear the confusion mixed with dawning realization. Sir, I'm showing authentication codes that check out. This is legitimate. For the first time since the ambush began, confusion replaced the controlled chaos in Mason's voice. That's impossible. But Arya was already moving, her earlier hesitation replaced by clinical precision. She had spotted the primary enemy firing position, a heavy machine gun nest carved into the rock face that was pinning down the entire convoy. The Ghost Protocol activation had unlocked more than just authorization codes. In her equipment bag, alongside the standard translator gear, were items that no civilian contractor should possess. A tactical radio with frequencies that didn't appear on any standard military communication plan. GPS coordinates for fire support assets that officially didn't exist in this sector. And most importantly, the knowledge of where those assets were positioned. She had spent 3 years gathering intelligence on Taliban positions in this valley. Not for translation purposes, but for exactly this moment. Captain Rodriguez, I need 4 volunteers for immediate assault on the primary position. Grid reference. She rattled off coordinates with the accuracy of someone reading from a targeting system that was branded into her memory. Chen, that position is heavily fortified. It would take a full squad to... 4 volunteers, Captain. That's an order. The word hung in the air, order. Not a request or suggestion, but a command delivered with the expectation of absolute obedience. Rodriguez gathered 4 of his best soldiers, their expressions mixing confusion with desperate hope. They had been trained to follow orders from legitimate authority, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for taking commands from their translator. What's the plan? Rodriguez asked. Arya's response revealed training that no civilian contractor should possess. Suppressing fire on my mark. I'll move up the left flank using the terrain feature at grid 314 Tans 227. When I reach the elevated position, you advance directly on the primary target. You'll be completely exposed, Rodriguez protested. No, Arya replied, checking her sidearm with practiced efficiency. I won't. She moved across the battlefield with skills that made seasoned soldiers stop and stare. Her knowledge of the terrain was perfect, utilizing micro-terrain features and dead space that she couldn't possibly have seen from their position. She moved like someone who had studied this valley extensively, not someone encountering it for the first time. The Taliban fighters were focused on the main American position, unaware of the lone figure moving through their blind spots. When Arya reached the elevated position, she had a clear view of the entire enemy formation. Her next radio transmission was calm and precise, all positions identified, calling in fire support. Chen, we don't have artillery support available, Rodriguez replied. Yes, we do. 30 seconds later, precision mortar fire began falling on Taliban positions with devastating accuracy. Each round struck exactly where Arya had directed, eliminating the heavy weapons that had pinned down the convoy. But the fire support wasn't coming from any official military asset. It was coming from operators who had been watching this valley for months, waiting for the moment when their carefully placed observer would need backup. Colonel Mason's voice crackled over the radio, weak with shock. Where did that fire support come from? Assets you weren't briefed on, Colonel, Arya replied. Now we complete the withdrawal. The extraction proceeded with the same precision as the fire support. Vehicles that had seemed disabled were quickly restored to mobility by recovery teams that appeared from nowhere. Wounded soldiers were evacuated by medical personnel who materialized with equipment that wasn't supposed to exist in this sector. As the convoy reached safety, Colonel Mason sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just occurred. His translator had somehow assumed command of his operation, called in fire support that wasn't on any official order of battle, and coordinated a tactical withdrawal that saved his entire unit. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was realizing that someone had been watching his every move for months, documenting his decisions, assessing his capabilities, and preparing for the moment when his tactical limitations would require intervention. Captain Rodriguez found Arya as she prepared to board an evacuation helicopter that had arrived without being requested through official channels. "Who are you really?" he asked. Arya's civilian contractor facade was already returning, but Rodriguez could see through it now. The way she held herself, the precision of her movements, the calm competence in the face of deadly chaos. "Someone who used to translate different things in different places," she said. "Used to?" She handed him a small device no larger than a thumb drive. "Your colonel is a good man, Captain, but he doesn't understand unconventional warfare. If you ever need someone who does..." She gestured to the device. "This works anywhere in the world." "How do I explain what happened here? Taliban ambush repelled by superior firepower and tactical positioning," Arya replied simply. "Sometimes the best operations are the ones that get simplified in the after-action reports." Rodriguez stared at the device in his palm. "Will I ever see you again?" "If you need to, Captain, you won't know it." The helicopter lifted off, carrying Arya away from FOB Courage. Below, Colonel Mason sat in the medical tent, receiving treatment for minor shrapnel wounds and major damage to his ego. Captain Rodriguez approached him with the official after-action report. "Sir, about Chen. What about her?" Mason's voice was tight with barely controlled confusion and humiliation. "Her personnel file has been updated. She's being transferred to a new assignment." Mason looked up sharply. "Where?" "Classified above our clearance level, sir." Rodriguez handed him the report, but Mason's eyes were fixed on something else entirely. On his desk lay a classified briefing folder he'd never seen before, marked with security classifications that exceeded his own clearance level. Inside was a single page with a brief explanation that turned his understanding of military hierarchy upside down. Section 7 emergency protocols existed for situations where operational necessity exceeded normal command authority. Assets operating under these protocols answered to levels of government that field commanders weren't cleared to know about. "Rodriguez," Mason said quietly, "in your estimation, how many of our contractors might be more than they appear?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "With respect, sir, I think that's not something we're supposed to know." A new translator arrived at FOB Courage. Young, male, clearly nervous about his first deployment. When Captain Rodriguez asked him about his predecessor, the young man looked confused. "Sir, according to my briefing, this position has been vacant for 6 months." Rodriguez nodded and filed away his questions. Some people, he realized, moved through the military system like ghosts, appearing when needed and vanishing when their work was done. The best soldiers, he was learning, weren't always the ones wearing uniforms. But late at night, when he was alone in his quarters, Rodriguez would sometimes take out the small device Arya had given him. He never activated it, never tried to make contact. But knowing it was there, knowing that somewhere in the world someone was watching and protecting people who didn't even know they needed protection, made the darkness a little less frightening. In the village near the valley where the ambush had occurred, an elderly shepherd told his grandson about the strange morning when the mountains shook with explosions, but all the foreign soldiers had walked away alive. It was, he said, the kind of thing that happened when angels moved among mortals, protecting them from dangers they couldn't see. The grandson listened politely, but privately dismissed the story as the imagination of an old man. Some truths, the shepherd knew, were too large for young minds to accept. But that night, as the boy lay in his bed, he wondered about the American woman who had sat quietly in their village for months, listening to stories and drinking tea with the elders. She had spoken their language like someone born to it, understood their customs like family. And then one day, she had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but memories and a feeling that she had been more than she appeared. 6 months later, in a briefing room that appeared on no official building directory, a woman with different hair and different documents received her next assignment. The name on her identification read Sarah Mitchell, cultural attaché, but the briefing materials told a different story. "The target is a military training facility in Eastern Europe," the briefing officer explained. Intelligence suggests weapons trafficking, but we need someone on the inside to confirm. Cover identity? She asked. Administrative assistant. Low level, invisible, forgettable. She smiled slightly. My specialty. This one's different. The facility commander is sharp. Former special operations. He won't be as easy to fool as Colonel Mason. Her smile faded. Mason was a good officer. He just didn't understand what he was dealing with. None of them do. That's what makes you effective. She accepted the new identity documents, feeling the familiar weight of becoming someone else. Duration. As long as it takes. Could be months. Could be years. Outside the briefing room's bulletproof windows, rain drummed against glass, just as it had 3 years ago when Arya Chen was born. Some soldiers fought wars that appeared in history books. Others fought wars that existed only in classified files and half-remembered stories told by old men to children who didn't believe them. But the wars were real, and the people who fought them were real, even if their names and faces changed with each mission. They moved through the world like shadows, protecting people who would never know their names or understand their sacrifices. And sometimes, when everything went wrong and conventional military wisdom failed, they stepped out of the shadows just long enough to remind everyone that the real heroes were often the ones nobody saw coming.